She didn't say hello. That was the first thing I noticed. I had picked up on the second ring, still half asleep, the bedroom dark, except for the glow of the clock. On my nightstand, reading 7:14 inches the morning. I thought it might be my son. It wasn't. It was his wife. And the first words out of her mouth were, "Did you get the transfer request I sent over?" Not good morning. Not how are you feeling. Not even a basic acknowledgement that she was calling before most people had finished their coffee. Just the transfer request, as if I were an accounting department she'd been waiting on. I told her I hadn't seen anything in my email. She said she'd sent it the night before. She said the renovation costs had run over and they needed the additional funds by the end of the week or the contractor would walk. I said I'd look into it and call her back. She said sooner, rather than later, would be helpful. Then she hung up. I sat there in the quiet of my bedroom for a long moment, holding the phone, listening to the house settle around me the way old houses do in the early morning. The oak tree outside my window was just starting to lose its leaves. I'd planted that tree the year my son was born, 34 years ago. I remember the afternoon clearly, my wife and I in the backyard, our hands muddy, laughing at nothing in particular, the way young couples laugh when the future still feels like something they get to design themselves. My wife passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 13 months from diagnosis to the end. After that, the house got very quiet. My son had moved to Portland 8 years earlier to be with his wife's family. We talked on the phone when we could. I flew out twice a year. It wasn't the closeness I had imagined when he was small, but it was something, and I told myself something was enough. When he came to me 2 years ago with the idea for the restaurant, I listened for a long time before I said anything. He was passionate in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, with a guitar he was convinced would change his life. He talked about the concept, a farm-to-table place, in a neighborhood that was just starting to come up, the kind of spot that locals would make a habit of, the kind of place that builds a community around it. His wife had experience in hospitality management. He had spent the last 3 years working under a chef he admired enormously. The timing, he said, felt right. I asked him what he needed. He said they had some savings, but the build-out costs and the first 6 months of operating capital would require more than they had. He said they had looked at SBA loans, but the interest rates were difficult, and the bank wanted more collateral than they could offer. I asked him how much. He said $320,000. I didn't flinch. I want to be clear about that. I didn't flinch because I had spent 31 years as a civil engineer, because I had paid off my house, because I had lived carefully and saved consistently, and because the man sitting across the table from me was my son, and he was asking me to help him build something real. My wife and I had always talked about what we would do with what we'd saved. We never imagined spending it on ourselves beyond the basics. We imagined this moments where the money could become something more than a number on a statement. I told him yes. We shook hands, the two of us, there in my kitchen. He looked at me with an expression I still think about, something between gratitude and the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time. I told him we should probably put something in writing, just to keep things organized. He nodded and said, absolutely, of course, whatever made me comfortable. We never did get around to the paperwork. That is the sentence I return to most often when I think about what happened next. We never did get around to the paperwork. Over the following weeks, I wired the money in 3 transfers. The first was $140,000, the second was $110,000, and the third was $70,000, sent in early spring when they said the kitchen equipment deposits were due. Every time, my son called after the money arrived, and he sounded grateful and excited, and I went to bed on those nights, feeling like I had done something that mattered. Then the calls got a little less frequent. I told myself he was busy. Opening a restaurant is not a small undertaking. There are permits and inspections and staffing decisions and supplier relationships and 100 other moving pieces that demand attention around the clock. I had read enough about the industry to know that the months leading up to an opening are a kind of controlled chaos. I gave him space because I thought that was what a good father did. I sent a text in late July asking if there was a projected opening date. He responded 2 days later, 2 days with a message that said things were moving along and he'd keep me posted. I sent another text in August. He called back that evening, briefly, and said they were targeting sometime in September, maybe early October. He sounded distracted. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes, of course, just a lot of moving pieces. I said I understood. I said I was proud of him. He said thanks, Dad, and then said he had to get going. That was the last time we spoke before his wife called me about the transfer request. After I hung up with her that morning, I went to my computer and found the email she had referenced. It had come in at 11:48 the previous night. It was not a personal note. It was a forwarded invoice from a construction company I had never heard of, with a total of $31,000 and a handwritten note at the top in my daughter-in-law's handwriting that said, "Need this covered as soon as possible, already behind on two others. Already behind on two others." I read that line several times. I set down my coffee and I read it several more times after that. I picked up the phone and called my son. It went to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me when he had a chance, that I had some questions about the invoice. I kept my voice even. I had spent enough years in project management to know that panicking before you have complete information is a waste of energy. He did not call back that day. I drove to the library that afternoon. I still prefer doing certain kinds of research in person, at a table, with a notepad, and I spent 2 hours reading everything I could find about the neighborhood in Portland, where the restaurant was supposed to be located. I found a local business journal article from 6 weeks earlier. The headline was about new openings in the district. The restaurant was listed. It had already opened. The article described the concept, the chef behind it, the early reviews. It mentioned the owners. My son's wife was listed by name. My son was listed by name. My name was not mentioned anywhere. The article had a photograph. The exterior of the building, a ribbon across the door, a small crowd gathered outside. My son was in the photograph. His wife was in the photograph. Her parents were in the photograph. I recognized her father from the one time I had met him at the wedding. There were other people I did not recognize. I was not in the photograph because I had not been there. I had not been there because no one had invited me. I sat at that library table for a long time. Outside the window, a woman was walking a golden retriever through the parking lot. The dog was moving slowly, sniffing at something along the curb, and the woman was waiting patiently, letting it take its time. I watched them until they moved out of sight. I drove home. I ate dinner alone, the way I had eaten most dinners for 4 years. I did not call my son that night. I needed to think clearly, and I have learned, over 67 years of living, that clear thinking and fresh emotion do not occupy the same space at the same time. The next morning I called the county recorder's office in Portland. I explained that I was trying to look up the registered ownership of a business and asked how I might go about that. The woman on the phone walked me through the process patiently. I found the restaurant's LLC registration online. The registered members were listed. My son's name was there. His wife's name was there. The ownership split was 60% to his wife's holding company and 40% to my son. I wrote that down on my notepad. Then I started looking at the holding company. It had been registered 18 months earlier. My son's name did not appear in its registration documents anywhere. I wrote that down too. I called a friend of mine who had practiced business law for 30 years before retiring. We played golf together every other Saturday when the weather allowed. I told him what I had found. I walked him through the transfers, the amounts, the timeline, the LLC structure. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "Did you ever sign anything? A loan agreement? A promissory note? Anything at all?" I said no. He said, "That's a problem and it's not a problem, depending on how you want to look at it." He explained that without documentation, I would have difficulty arguing in court that the money was a loan rather than a gift. But he also said that the LLC structure, the way the holding company had been set up before they ever came to me for money, the way the ownership was weighted suggested a degree of premeditation that a good attorney could work with. I thanked him. I told him I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do. He said to take my time and call him when I was ready. I spent 3 days going back through my bank records, my email history, every text message I had exchanged with my son and his wife over the past 2 years. I printed everything out and organized it chronologically. I am a methodical person, by nature and by training. When I worked as an engineer, I understood that the quality of your conclusion depends entirely on the quality of your documentation. I applied the same standard now. What I found, laid out in sequence, told a story that was different from the one I had been telling myself. The initial request had come to me 6 weeks after the holding company was formed. The invoices I had received there had been several, not just the original request, were all from vendors I could not independently verify as connected to the restaurant. One of them, a design firm, had an address that turned out to be a residential property. Another, a supplier listed on 2 of the invoices, had no web presence, no reviews, no business registration I could locate in Oregon. I am not a suspicious man by temperament. I want to say that clearly. I grew up in a household where you took people at their word and you expected the same in return. My father was that kind of man, and I tried to be that kind of man. And I tried to raise my son to be that kind of man. What I was looking at now did not fit neatly into that framework, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. On a Thursday morning, 10 days after his wife's first call, I booked a flight to Portland. I did not tell them I was coming. I arrived on a Friday afternoon and checked into a hotel 2 miles from the restaurant. I ate dinner at a diner nearby and went to bed early. On Saturday morning, I drove past the restaurant. It was open. Through the front window, I could see a dining room that was full, a hostess moving between tables, the particular warm light of a room that has been decorated with care. The sign above the door was simple and clean. My son's name was part of it. His wife's name was part of it. They had picked a good location. The neighborhood was exactly the kind of place he had described to me 2 years earlier in my kitchen. I sat in my rental car for a while. Then I drove back to the hotel. That afternoon I called my son. He answered on the third ring. He said, "Dad? Hey. Sorry I haven't called back. It's been." I said, "I'm in Portland." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be meaningful. He said, "You're here?" I said I was. I said I would like to have dinner with him and his wife that evening, somewhere quiet, somewhere we could talk without rushing. I said I thought it was time we caught up properly. Another pause. Then he said he would check with his wife and text me back. His wife texted me 40 minutes later with the name of a restaurant, a different one from theirs. I noticed, and a time of 7 o'clock. I arrived 5 minutes early and sat with my back to the wall, the way my father had always done in restaurants. Old habit. My son and his wife arrived together, on time. She looked composed, professionally dressed, even for a casual dinner. My son looked the way a man looks when he has been told something is going to happen and he is not sure how it will go. We ordered. We made small talk through the appetizers, the flight, the weather, the neighborhood, the fall colors. I let it breathe. I am in no hurry when I know what I want to say. After the server cleared the first course, I set my phone on the table. I had loaded the photographs, the business journal article, the LLC registration documents, the holding company filings, the side-by-side comparison of the invoices against the vendors I could not verify. I slid the phone across to my son. I said, "I'd like to talk about the restaurant." He looked at the phone. He looked at his wife. Something moved across her face that was not quite surprise, but close enough to tell me that she had not expected me to be this prepared. I said, "I know it opened. I saw the article. It looks like it's doing well, and I'm genuinely glad about that. I want you both to know that." My son started to say something. I raised one hand gently, not to silence him, just to ask for a moment. I said, "I also know I wasn't at the opening. I know I wasn't told about the opening, and I've been trying to understand why, because I think I deserve to understand why." His wife said, "We kept it small. It was just," I said, "her parents were there." She stopped. I said, "I saw the photograph in the article. Her parents were there. So it wasn't about keeping it small. I want to give you both a chance to explain that to me, because right now I can only think of one explanation, and I would rather be wrong." The table was very quiet. At the table beside us, a couple was laughing at something on their phone. The restaurant was warm and the lighting was good, and it was an ordinary Friday evening for everyone in that room except us. My son looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have called you. I should have." He stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck. She thought it might be awkward because of the money situation. I said, "What money situation?" He didn't answer right away. I said, "I'm asking genuinely. I'd like to hear how you'd describe it." His wife said the build-out had cost more than projected. She said the additional requests had been for legitimate overages. She said the ownership structure was standard for their type of arrangement. I said, "Which arrangement is that, exactly?" She said it was a family investment structure. I said, "Can you help me understand how a family investment structure results in the investor holding no equity in the business and no membership in any of the registered entities?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at her husband. I said, "I'm not here to make threats. I want to be very clear about that. I'm here because I'm your father, and because I believe that if we can't talk honestly about what happened here, then we have a much larger problem than money." My son put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face. He sat like that for a while. His wife was looking at the breadbasket. I said, $320,000 is not a small number for a man on a fixed income. A significant portion of that was money your mother and I set aside over the course of a marriage. I gave it because I love you and because I believed in what you were trying to build. That hasn't changed. What I'm asking for now is honesty. My son dropped his hands. His eyes were red. He said, I didn't know about the holding company structure until after the first transfer. She said it was just how the accountant had set it up. I should have pushed back. I know, I should have pushed back. His wife said his name, sharply. I looked at her and said, let him talk. She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she picked up her water glass and looked away. My son told me what I had already pieced together, more or less, but there is a difference between a document and a voice, and hearing it from him made it real in a way the paperwork had not. The holding company had been his wife's idea. The split had been her suggestion. The vendors on 2 of the later invoices, he admitted this slowly, haltingly, in the way a person admits something they have known for a while and have been hoping would resolve itself, were companies connected to her family. He had questioned it once. She had said it was efficient, that keeping it in the family on both sides made sense, that he was overthinking it. He had let it go. I listened to all of it without raising my voice. When he finished, I thanked him for telling me. I meant it. I said, here is what I would like to happen now. I would like a formal accounting of where the $320,000 went. Every dollar. With documentation. I would like my attorney to review the operating agreement and advise me on what a reasonable arrangement would look like going forward. And I would like some kind of acknowledgement in writing, because I should have required writing from the beginning, and that's partly on me of the investment I made and what it represents. His wife said, that sounds like you're preparing to sue us. I said, it sounds like I'm asking to be treated like a person who gave your family a great deal of money and deserves to know what happened to it. If you'd prefer I go straight to an attorney without this conversation, I can do that. She said nothing. My son said, no, Dad. We'll get you what you need. We finished dinner without much more discussion. When we stood to leave, my son put his arms around me in the parking lot and held on for longer than he usually did. He smelled the way he had as a boy after a long day outside something familiar that I couldn't quite name. I held him back. Whatever was broken between us was not going to be fixed in a parking lot on a Friday night, but something had been said that needed to be said, and there is a particular kind of relief that comes with that, even when the situation is still hard. He called me the following Tuesday. He said he had retained his own attorney, separate from his wife. He said the attorney had reviewed everything, and they wanted to discuss restructuring my stake in the business. 3 months later, I had a signed agreement. It wasn't everything I had put in, and I made my peace with that. What I recovered was meaningful. What I documented was more meaningful still. And what I learned, what I carry with me now as clearly as I carry anything, is something I wish I had understood before I ever wrote the first check. Money is the simplest part of any family transaction. You can count it, transfer it, document it. What is harder to account for is what the money represents, the years of work behind it, the relationship it's being offered inside of, the trust it requires to move from one hand to another without a contract. I had confused generosity with unconditional surrender. I had believed that requiring structure meant implying doubt, and I had confused love with the absence of documentation. My son and I still talk. It is careful now, in the way things are careful after they've been dropped and put back together. You can use it, but you handle it differently than before. His wife and I are civil. I do not expect more than that, and I do not pretend to. The restaurant is doing well. I have heard this from my son, and I have read it in 2 more articles since. Part of me is glad. A part that I am honest enough to admit exists is something more complicated than glad. But when I think about it for long enough, what I come back to is not the money, and not the opening I was not invited to, and not the holding company I was not told about. What I come back to is the afternoon I drove past the restaurant for the first time. The full dining room, the warm light, the neighborhood exactly as my son had described it, in my kitchen, 2 years earlier. When he looked at me with that expression, that particular relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long, he built the thing he said he would build. That part was real. I am 67 years old. I have learned that you can hold 2 true things at the same time, even when they push against each other. You can grieve what happened and still acknowledge what was good about what you set in motion. You can require accountability without releasing the love underneath it. You can be a father who was taken advantage of, and still be a father who was glad he said yes to the dream, even knowing what came after. What I would tell any parent sitting where I sat, anyone who has a child asking them to believe in something, anyone considering moving money and trust in the same direction at the same time is this: write it down. Not because you don't love them, because you do. A contract is not suspicion. A contract is respect. It says, I take this seriously enough to put the terms in writing. It says, I believe in this enough to protect it with structure. The absence of paperwork doesn't make the love more real. It just makes the recovery harder when something goes wrong. And something, eventually, in one form or another, always has the potential to go wrong. That is not pessimism. That is what 67 years looks like when you're honest with yourself about it. The oak tree in my backyard is still there. It dropped most of its leaves by mid-November and stood bare through December and January, the way it does every year, the way it has for 34 years. And then in early March, the way it always does, the new growth started coming in at the tips of the branches, small and green and unhurried, not making a statement about it, just doing the thing it does. I watched it from my kitchen window one morning and thought about my son, about the restaurant, about the money and the holding company and the opening I wasn't invited to and the parking lot where he held on longer than usual. Then I poured a second cup of coffee and I went out to the backyard and I stood under the tree in the cold March air for a while. The ground was soft under my feet. A cardinal landed on the fence at the far end of the yard, sat there for a moment looking at nothing in particular, and then was gone. I went back inside. There was still a full day ahead of me, and I intended to use it well.